The waitress was humiliated at a fancy restaurant. The Mafia boss stood up and said, "Lessons on me." Chapter 1. The crystal chandeliers of La Fontaine hung like frozen tears above the heads of Manhattan's elite. It was a Friday evening in late autumn, and the kind of cold that seeps through expensive wool coats had settled over the city. Inside, however, warmth radiated from every polished surface, every silk napkin, every whispered conversation about stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. Clara Mitchell moved between tables with practiced grace, her worn black flats silent against the Italian marble floors. She had worked at La Fontaine for 3 years now, long enough to know every regular's preferred table, every chef's mood swing, every manager's particular brand of cruelty. At 27, she had learned that survival in this world meant invisibility. The wealthy didn't want to see her. They wanted their wine glasses filled as if by magic, their plates cleared by ghosts. Tonight, however, fate had other plans. The reservation had come in that afternoon, a party of 12 for the private dining room, requested by someone whose name made the general manager nearly drop his coffee cup. Vincent Moretti. Even Clara, who made a point of not knowing things she shouldn't know, recognized that name. Everyone in New York did. Officially, he was a businessman with interests in construction, shipping, and real estate. Unofficially, the Moretti family had controlled the northeastern seaboard's underground economy for 3 generations, but Clara didn't care about that. She cared about the rent that was due in 6 days, the tuition payment for her younger brother's community college that she was still $300 short on, and the fact that her mother's medication had gone up in price again. She cared about getting through another shift without crying in the walk-in freezer, which had become an unfortunate habit lately. The private dining room buzzed with masculine energy when she entered carrying a tray of appetizers. 12 men in suits that cost more than her annual salary sat around the long mahogany table, their laughter deep and confident. At the head of the table sat a man whose presence seemed to quiet the air around him. Vincent Moretti was not what she had expected. At 42, he had the kind of face that belonged in black and white photographs, all sharp angles and shadows. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, she noticed when they briefly met hers, were the grey of storm clouds rolling over the Hudson. He didn't smile when he looked at her. He simply looked, and something in that look made her feel both seen and protected in a way she couldn't explain. She served the appetizers efficiently, professionally, invisible as always, until she wasn't. The man to Vincent's left was named Richard Castellano, though Clara wouldn't learn this until later. What she knew in that moment was simply that his hand had found its way to her hip as she leaned to place his plate, and that his grip was too tight to be accidental. She flinched. The plate slipped. A perfectly arranged tower of seared tuna toppled onto Richard's pristine white shirt, leaving a streak of wasabi aioli across the silk like a wound. The room went silent. Richard's face transformed from smugness to rage in the span of a heartbeat. He shoved back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. "You stupid, worthless woman," he snarled, his voice carrying through the now open door and into the main dining room beyond. "Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs? More than you make in a month, I guarantee you that." Clara stood frozen, her hands trembling around the empty tray. Words piled up in her throat, apologies and explanations, and the desperate need to say that he had touched her first, that this wasn't her fault. But she knew how this went. She had seen it before. The customer was always right, especially when the customer could buy and sell the entire restaurant without checking his bank balance. "I'm so sorry, sir," she managed. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning." Dry cleaning? Dry. Richard laughed, a cruel sound that made several of the other men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "This shirt is ruined." "You're ruined. I want to speak to your manager." "Actually, no. I want you fired. Right now. Tonight." The general manager, a thin man named Harold, whose primary skill was agreeing with wealthy people, appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the scent of conflict. His eyes took in the scene. The stained shirt, the trembling waitress, the furious customer, and Clara watched his face perform the calculation she had seen 100 times before. One waitress, easily replaced, weighed against one powerful man whose displeasure could tank their Yelp rating and their Michelin ambitions. "Miss Mitchell," Harold began, his tone already resigned. "Perhaps it would be best if—" That's when Vincent Moretti stood up. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it stopped every other sound in the room. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his jacket, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even. The kind of voice that didn't need to be raised because it knew it would be heard. "Richard," he said, "sit down." It wasn't a request. Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He sat down. Vincent turned to Clara, and for a moment his expression softened almost imperceptibly. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't name, something that looked almost like recognition. Then he turned back to the table. "I believe," he said, addressing the room but somehow speaking only to Richard, "that this young woman was simply doing her job when she was distracted by something unexpected, something unwelcome." His gaze settled on Richard's hand, now pressed flat against the table as if trying to disappear. "Isn't that right?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Richard's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "I don't know what you're—" "The lesson," Vincent continued, as if Richard hadn't spoken, "is on me tonight." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a money clip thick with bills. He peeled off several and placed them on the table in front of Clara, not looking at her, still addressing the room. "This should cover the shirt, the dry cleaning, and the lesson in manners that my associate clearly needs." Clara stared at the money. There had to be at least $2,000 there. Her hands wouldn't move to pick it up. Vincent finally looked at her again, and this time the softness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Take it," he said quietly. "You've earned it." "Sir, I can't—" "You can," he said, and then lower, meant only for her. "What's your name, Clara?" she whispered. "Clara Mitchell." "Clara," he nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "Clara Mitchell," he said, "go home, your shift is over, and if anyone gives you trouble about it, you tell them to speak to me." She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that she couldn't afford to lose the tips from the rest of the night, that Harold would surely fire her anyway, once the Moretti party left, that taking money from a man like Vincent Moretti was probably dangerous in ways she couldn't even imagine, but something in his voice made her trust him. Something in his eyes made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was worth protecting. She took the money. She walked out of the private dining room, past a stunned Harold, past the staring faces of the other waitstaff. She collected her coat from the break room, her hands still shaking, and she walked out into the cold November night. Behind her, in the private dining room, Vincent Moretti sat back down. He picked up his wineglass, swirled it once, and took a long sip. "Richard," he said pleasantly, "we need to have a conversation about the way you treat people who can't fight back, and I think you're going to find it very educational." The next morning, Clara woke in her small apartment in Queens to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer anyway. "Miss Mitchell?" The voice was female, crisp and professional. "My name is Angela Romano. I'm the executive assistant to Vincent Moretti. Mr. Moretti would like to know if you're available for a meeting this afternoon. There's a matter he wishes to discuss with you." Clara sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. A matter? What matter? What could a man like Vincent Moretti possibly want to discuss with a waitress he'd met for 5 minutes? Yes, she heard herself say. "I'm available." "Excellent. A car will pick you up at 3 o'clock. Please dress professionally. And Miss Mitchell? Mr. Moretti asked me to assure you that you have nothing to worry about. This is an opportunity, not a problem." The line went dead. Clara stared at her phone for a long moment. Outside her window, the grey November sky pressed down on the city like a weight. She thought about the money still sitting in her coat pocket, uncounted. She thought about the way Vincent Moretti had looked at her, as if she were a person worth seeing. She thought about how, for 3 years, she had been invisible. Maybe it was time to be seen. The car that arrived at 3 o'clock was black and sleek and utterly silent. The driver, a large man with kind eyes who introduced himself simply as Marco, held the door open for her without comment. Clara slid into the leather interior, clutching her purse like a lifeline, and tried to remember how to breathe. They drove through Manhattan, past the familiar landmarks that had always seemed to belong to a world she could observe, but never enter. The Chrysler Building gleaming in the weak autumn sun. Central Park, its trees stripped bare and dignified in their nakedness. The endless flow of yellow cabs and hurrying pedestrians, who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Clara had never known where she was going. She had spent her whole life reacting, surviving, getting through one day to reach the next. Her father had left when she was 12, disappearing into a bottle, and then out of their lives entirely. Her mother had worked double shifts until her body gave out, and now Clara worked double shifts to pay for the medication that kept her mother alive. Her brother Jake was the bright spot, the hope, the one who might actually escape this cycle of exhaustion and barely making it. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed when the car stopped. They were in front of a building she recognized from magazine covers. The Moretti Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel that dominated the midtown skyline. She had walked past it 1,000 times, never imagining she would ever go inside. Marco opened her door. "This way, Miss Mitchell." The lobby was all marble and light, with a waterfall feature that somehow managed to sound like music rather than plumbing. Angela Romano was waiting for her by the private elevator, a tall woman with silver hair and the kind of bone structure that suggested she had been beautiful once and had aged into something even better. "Miss Mitchell." Angela's smile was warm, but businesslike. "Right on time. Mr. Moretti appreciates punctuality. Come with me." The elevator rose so smoothly that Clara barely felt the motion. Only the numbers climbing on the digital display told her they were moving at all. 40, 41, 42. The doors opened onto a space that made the lobby look modest by comparison. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city spread out below like a map of possibilities. The furniture was minimal but clearly expensive, each piece chosen with deliberate care. And there, standing by the window with his back to her, was Vincent Moretti. He turned when he heard her enter, and once again, Clara was struck by how different he was from her expectations. There was no menace in his posture, no threatening edge to his expression. He looked, if anything, tired, human. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "thank you for coming. Please, sit down." She sat in the chair he indicated, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Angela disappeared through a side door, leaving them alone. Vincent didn't sit. He remained standing by the window, looking out at the city that was in some ways his. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Clara blinked. "An apology? Sir, you don't—" "Not for last night, for what happened after you left." Her stomach dropped. "What happened after I left?" He turned to face her then, and his expression was carefully neutral. "Richard Castellano won't be bothering you or anyone else again, but the manner of his departure from my organization was public. There's a chance you may see news reports. I wanted you to hear the truth from me first." Clara's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. "What did you do to him?" Vincent's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Nothing permanent. I simply made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable, and I transferred him to a position where he'll have significantly less opportunity for contact with the public. He'll be counting inventory in a warehouse in New Jersey for the foreseeable future." He paused, "And I may have shared some information with his wife about certain habits of his that she was unaware of." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know that what he did to you had consequences. Because in my world, actions have weight. And because—" He paused, something flickering behind those storm-grey eyes. "I found myself unable to stop thinking about the look on your face last night. The way you stood there, trying to apologize for something that wasn't your fault. The way you were ready to take responsibility for someone else's cruelty." He moved away from the window, closer to her, though he maintained a respectful distance. "I've seen a lot of people, Miss Mitchell. I've seen people lie to my face and smile while they do it. I've seen people sacrifice everything good in themselves for money, for power, for things that turn to dust in the end. But I've rarely seen someone with your particular quality." "What quality?" "Integrity under pressure." He said it simply, like stating a fact. "You didn't fight back last night, but not because you were weak. You didn't fight back because you were calculating, weighing the cost of resistance against your need for that job. You were thinking about whoever depends on you, whoever you're working those late nights to support. You chose survival over pride, and that's a kind of strength most people never understand." Clara found she couldn't look away from him. No one had ever seen her so clearly, no one had ever bothered to look. "I have a proposition for you," Vincent continued. "Not what you might think." He held up a hand, forestalling the objection she hadn't quite formed yet. "I need a new assistant, someone to handle my personal schedule, my correspondence, my day-to-day life outside of business. Angela handles the professional side, but she's been asking to reduce her hours. Her grandchildren apparently are far more interesting than I am." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The job pays well, very well. It includes health insurance, which I understand is a consideration for someone in your position. It offers stability, growth, and the chance to work for someone who will never, under any circumstances, allow you to be treated the way you were treated last night." Clara's head was spinning. This morning she had been worried about making rent. Now a man who controlled half of New York's underground economy was offering her a job as his personal assistant. "Why me?" she asked. You don't know me. You saw me for 5 minutes, and most of that time I was trembling like a leaf. I know enough, Vincent said. I know you've been working at La Fontaine for 3 years without a single customer complaint, despite dealing with some of the most demanding people in the city. I know you're putting your brother through college while caring for a sick mother. I know you live in a studio apartment in Queens that you've somehow managed to make into a home despite its limitations. He paused. I did some research this morning. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. She should have been angry. She should have been frightened by the casual mention of her personal details, proof that this man could find out anything about anyone whenever he wanted. Instead, she felt something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like hope. What would I have to do? Everything legal, he said firmly. Let me be clear about that. My business has many aspects, and some of them exist in grey areas, but your role would be entirely above board. You would manage my calendar, handle my personal correspondence, coordinate with my household staff, and occasionally accompany me to events where I require someone presentable and intelligent at my side. Accompany you to events, Clara repeated slowly. Dinners, galas, functions where I'm expected to appear human rather than simply powerful. Vincent's expression was wry. You'd be surprised how difficult it is to find someone willing to tell me when I'm being boring at a charity auction. Clara laughed before she could stop herself, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch both of them off guard. I'll need to think about it, she said, though even as she spoke she knew what her answer would be. Can I have until tomorrow? Of course. Vincent nodded, his expression warming slightly. Marco will take you home. And Miss Mitchell, whatever you decide, keep the money from last night. You've more than earned it. She stood and he stood with her, a gesture of courtesy that seemed completely natural to him. At the elevator, she paused and looked back. Mr. Moretti, why did you really stand up for me last night before you knew anything about me? Before any of this? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then quietly he said, because my mother was a waitress. She worked in a diner in Brooklyn for 20 years, and I remember the way people treated her, the way they looked right through her, like she didn't exist, like she didn't matter. His eyes met hers, and there was something raw in them now, something he usually kept hidden. She mattered, he said, and so do you. The elevator doors closed between them, and Clara Mitchell rode down 42 floors in a state of wonder, her heart full of something she hadn't felt in years, something that felt like possibility. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, stories about ordinary people discovering their extraordinary worth, are what we bring to you every week. If you believe that everyone deserves to be seen, hit that subscribe button and join us for the journey. Chapter 2. The first week of Clara's new job passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. The Moretti household, she discovered, was a complex organism with dozens of moving parts, and she was expected to keep all of them running smoothly. Vincent's personal residence occupied the top 3 floors of the tower she had visited on that first day. The penthouse itself was surprisingly warm despite its vast size, filled with art that spoke of taste rather than ostentation, and books that showed signs of actually being read. There was a state-of-the-art kitchen that the private chef, a fierce Italian woman named Rosa, guarded with territorial pride. There was a library that Clara could have spent years exploring. There was a rooftop garden where, she would later discover, Vincent spent his mornings drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over his city. And there was the office, a glass-walled space where Clara set up her desk and began the work of understanding Vincent Moretti's life. He was, she quickly realized, a man of contradictions. His reputation painted him as ruthless, dangerous, a wolf in expensive clothing. But the man she observed in those early days was something different. He was exacting, yes, demanding of excellence from everyone around him. But he was also fair, remembering the names of every member of his staff, asking after their families, ensuring that no one worked overtime without compensation. He took his coffee black and his meetings efficient. He had little patience for flattery, and even less for dishonesty. He made decisions quickly, almost instinctively, and Clara learned to have information ready before he asked for it, anticipating his needs with a precision that seemed to please him. "You're good at this," he told her at the end of her first week, a note of surprise in his voice that she tried not to find insulting. "I'm a fast learner," she replied, organizing the papers on his desk into neat piles. "And I've spent years watching what wealthy people want before they know they want it." The restaurant was good training. He laughed at that, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "You know, most people are too intimidated to joke with me. Most people haven't seen you lose an argument with Rosa about whether hollandaise sauce requires fresh tarragon." The laugh deepened and something shifted between them. Some wall-falling that Clara hadn't even realized was there. "Fresh tarragon is essential," he said solemnly. "I will die on that hill. I'll make a note of it." As the weeks passed, Clara found herself settling into a rhythm that felt almost natural. She arrived at 7 each morning, reviewed Vincent's schedule over breakfast with Angela, and spent her days solving problems she hadn't known existed. The dry cleaning that needed to be retrieved before the gala, the birthday gift for a business associate's daughter that needed to be thoughtful but not excessive, the reservation at the restaurant that was supposedly fully booked for the next 3 months. She learned the names of the security team who rotated through the building in carefully coordinated shifts. She learned which board members could be trusted and which ones Vincent merely tolerated. She learned that he donated anonymously to a scholarship fund for children of single mothers, and that he visited his own mother's grave in Brooklyn every Sunday, without fail. She learned, without meaning to, the shape of his loneliness. It was December when she first noticed it, the way his apartment fell silent after the staff left each evening, the way he lingered over conversations with her as if reluctant to let them end. The penthouse was beautiful but empty, she realized. A showcase rather than a home. "Do you ever have anyone over?" she asked one evening, bold with exhaustion after a particularly demanding day. "Friends, I mean, not business associates." Vincent looked up from the report he was reading, something flickering behind his eyes. "I had friends once before I became what I am. Now I have allies, employees, and people who want something from me." He shrugged, the gesture almost careless. "It's a trade-off. Power for connection. Most days I think it's worth it. And the other days? The other days I talk to my assistant until she reminds me that it's past 10 o'clock and she has a train to catch." Clara flushed, suddenly aware of how late it had gotten. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "Don't apologize." He set down the report, giving her his full attention. "You're the first person in years who's treated me like a person rather than a position. It's refreshing." The air between them felt charged suddenly, full of something unspoken. Clara thought about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways it could go wrong. He was her employer. He was a powerful man with dangerous connections. He was, by any reasonable measure, someone she should keep at a professional distance. But he was also the man who had stood up for her when no one else would. The man who had seen her, really seen her, when she had been invisible for so long. "I should go," she said softly. "You should," he agreed. But he didn't look away. She gathered her things, said goodnight, walked to the elevator with her heart pounding in her chest. And all the way home through the cold December streets, she thought about the way he had looked at her, like she was something precious, something worth protecting. Christmas approached with all its attendant chaos. The Moretti Foundation's annual gala was scheduled for December 23rd, and Clara threw herself into the preparations with an intensity that left little room for the confusing feelings that had begun to plague her. The event was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in a space transformed by Clara's careful planning into a winter wonderland of white roses and silver candles. 500 guests in evening wear, sipping champagne and writing checks to causes they would forget by morning. The kind of glamour that Clara had only ever seen from the service entrance. Tonight, however, she stood at Vincent's side. The dress had arrived at her apartment 3 days earlier, a deep blue silk that made her feel like someone she had never been before. When she'd tried to refuse it, Vincent had simply said, "Consider it part of the uniform. I need my assistant to blend in, and that means looking the part." She hadn't argued further, partly because he was right, partly because when she put on the dress and looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look beautiful," Vincent said, when she emerged from the car at the museum steps. His voice was neutral, professional, but his eyes said something else entirely. "I look like I'm pretending to be someone else." "No." He offered her his arm, a gesture that felt natural despite its formality. "You look like you've finally stopped hiding." The gala itself was a whirlwind of introductions and small talk, champagne toasts and artful canapés. Clara smiled until her face ached, shook hands until her fingers felt numb, and all the while she felt Vincent's presence at her side like a steady flame. It was during the silent auction that Richard Castellano appeared. He had lost weight since Clara had last seen him, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that seemed somehow diminished. But his eyes, when they found her across the crowded room, held the same cruel spark she remembered. "Well, well," he said, approaching them with a confidence that seemed forced. "The waitress has certainly moved up in the world. Tell me, Vincent, is she worth it? Whatever she's doing to earn that dress." Vincent went very still, It was a different kind of stillness than Clara had seen before, not the calm of control, but the tension of a predator about to strike. "Richard," he said softly, "I thought we'd discussed this." "Oh, we did." Richard's smile was sharp and bitter. "You made your position very clear, but I've been doing some thinking these past few months, counting inventory in that warehouse you sent me to, and I've realized something." "What's that?" "That you've gotten soft." Richard's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby guests. "The Vincent Moretti I knew wouldn't have torpedoed a valuable business relationship over some waitress, unless, of course, there's something more going on." The accusations hung in the air like poison gas. Clara felt her face flush with shame and anger, all the familiar feelings of helplessness rushing back. But before she could speak, before Vincent could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Richard, is there a problem here?" The speaker was a woman in her 60s, elegant in black velvet, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Clara recognized her from photographs in Vincent's office. Catherine Moretti, his mother's sister, the family matriarch since his mother's passing. "No problem, Aunt Catherine," Vincent said smoothly. "Richard was just leaving." "I certainly hope so." Catherine's gaze swept over Richard with undisguised contempt. "Because I distinctly remember you being banned from family functions after that unpleasantness last month. Something about inappropriate comments to the catering staff at my birthday party." Richard's face went red. "That was a misunderstanding." "Leave," Catherine said, her voice like ice. "Now, before I have security escort you out in a manner that will make tomorrow's gossip columns." For a long moment, Richard seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a final venomous look at Clara, he turned and walked away. Catherine watched him go, then turned to Clara with an expression that softened considerably. "So," she said, "you're the young woman my nephew can't stop talking about." Clara faltered, unsure how to respond. "He talks about you," Catherine repeated. "At family dinners, during phone calls, he mentions your intelligence, your work ethic, your refusal to be impressed by wealth." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. The last time Vincent talked about someone this way, he was 16 and convinced he was going to marry the girl who sat next to him in chemistry class. "Aunt Catherine," Vincent said, a warning note in his voice, "I'm just making observations." She patted Clara's arm gently. "It's nice to see him happy, even if he doesn't quite realize that's what he is yet." She drifted away into the crowd, leaving Clara and Vincent standing together in a bubble of sudden awkwardness. "I'm sorry about that," Vincent said finally. "My aunt has opinions and she's not shy about sharing them. She seems wonderful." "She is." He paused, something uncertain in his expression. "And she's not wrong about any of it." Clara's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I mean that I've tried very hard to keep this professional. You're my employee. You're half my age. You're everything good and bright and untouched by the ugliness of my world. But," Clara whispered, "but I can't stop thinking about you. Every morning when you walk into my office, every evening when you leave, every moment in between." The confession hung between them, raw and real and terrifying. "We can't," Clara said, even as her heart screamed at her to say the opposite. "I know." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. "But I wanted you to know before this goes any further, or before we pretend that this is something it isn't, I wanted you to know what you mean to me." The music swelled around them, some orchestra playing holiday classics for people who weren't really listening. Clara thought about all the reasons this was impossible, all the ways it could destroy her. Then she thought about the way he had stood up for her in that restaurant, the way he had seen her when no one else would, the way he looked at her now, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. "What I mean to you," she repeated slowly. "Everything," he said simply. "You mean everything." Chapter 3. The winter deepened around them, and with it something shifted in the fabric of Clara's life. She still came to work each morning at 7. She still organized Vincent's schedule, coordinated with his staff, managed the endless details that kept his world running smoothly. But now there were other moments woven through her days, a hand that lingered on hers when she passed him a document, a look across a crowded room that said more than words ever could, a conversation that stretched late into the evening, fueled by wine and honesty and the slow dismantling of walls. They hadn't kissed. They hadn't crossed any line that couldn't be explained away as employer and employee, professional and proper. But they both knew what was building between them, inevitable as gravity, impossible to ignore. It was January when Clara's mother took a turn for the worse. The call came at 3 in the morning. Her brother Jake's voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom collapsed," he said. "They're taking her to Queen's General. Clara, they're saying it's her heart." She was at the hospital within the hour, still wearing the sweatpants and old t-shirt she had thrown on in her haste. Jake was in the waiting room, looking younger than his 20 years, looking like the little boy who had cried when their father left. "They said it was a cardiac event," he told her, his voice hollow. "Something about blockage. They're doing emergency surgery now." Clara held her brother as they waited, the harsh fluorescent lights turning everything the color of fear. She thought about her mother, tough little Maria Mitchell, who had worked her whole life to give her children something better, who had never complained, never asked for anything, never stopped believing that tomorrow would be brighter than today. The surgery took 4 hours. When the doctor finally emerged, his scrubs stained with evidence of the battle he had fought, Clara felt her knees go weak. "She's stable," he said. "The procedure was successful, but she's going to need significant rehabilitation, and she'll need monitoring for the rest of her life. We're looking at extended hospital stay, cardiac rehab, home care afterward." The relief was overwhelming, but it came tangled with a new kind of fear. Extended hospital stay, rehabilitation, home care. All of it translated to money, the one thing Clara never had enough of. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. "I can drop out of school," he said quietly. "Get a job, help with the costs." "No." Clara's voice was sharp, sharper than she intended. "Mom didn't work herself half to death so you could quit before you finish. We'll figure something out." But even as she said it, she had no idea how. She called in sick to work for the first time since she'd started, too exhausted and overwhelmed to face Vincent's world of luxury and power. She spent the day at her mother's bedside, watching the monitors beep and hum, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with each precious breath. It was evening when the knock came at the hospital room door. Clara looked up, expecting a nurse, and found Vincent Moretti standing in the doorway. He was out of place here, his expensive coat and polished shoes incongruous against the institutional beige of the hospital room. But his eyes, when they found hers, held nothing but concern. "Angela told me what happened," he said quietly. "I came as soon as I could. You didn't have to." "I wanted to." He stepped into the room, his gaze taking in the sleeping woman in the bed, the exhausted son in the corner chair, the weight that Clara was carrying on shoulders that suddenly felt too small. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. Clara started to say fine, the automatic response, the lie she had been telling for years. But something in his presence, something in the gentle way he was looking at her, broke through her defenses. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm so scared." And then she was crying, really crying, for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Vincent crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest while she sobbed into his expensive coat. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you." They stayed like that for a long time, while the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and Jake pretended to be asleep, and Clara's mother dreamed whatever dreams come to people who have just narrowly escaped death. Finally, when Clara's tears had subsided into hiccups and her breathing had steadied, Vincent pulled back slightly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope, which he pressed into her hands. "What is this? It's taken care of," he said simply. Clara opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a statement from the hospital's billing department, stamped with a single word: "Paid." "Vincent, I can't accept—" "It's already done." His voice was gentle but firm. "The surgery, the hospital stay, the rehabilitation, the home care, all of it. It's done, but why?" She looked up at him, tears threatening again. "Why would you do this?" "Because you're not just my assistant, Clara. Not anymore. Because you matter to me. Because when I thought about you sitting here, drowning in worry about money while your mother fought for her life, I couldn't stand it." He took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "I know this complicates things," he continued. "I know it changes the power dynamic between us in ways you might not be comfortable with. If you want to consider it a loan, we can set up a repayment plan. If you want to consider it a bonus, we can document it that way. Whatever you need to make this okay." Clara looked at him, this man who had started as a stranger and become so much more. This man who had seen her at her worst and her best and everything in between. This man who had just, without hesitation, lifted the heaviest burden she had ever carried. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "About me, about my family, about any of this?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "Because I know what it's like to watch your mother suffer, to feel helpless, to know that all the money in the world can't buy back the time you've lost." His eyes were distant, remembering. My mother worked herself into an early grave, he continued. She had a heart condition too, but she wouldn't stop, wouldn't slow down, because she had children to feed and a dream to chase. By the time I made enough money to help her, it was too late. She was already gone. Vincent, he shook his head, coming back to the present. I can't change what happened to her, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to you. I can make sure you have the time with your mother that I never got with mine. If you have been touched by this story, if you understand what it means to love someone so much you would do anything to protect them, write in the comments, "Family is everything." Let me know if you feel this moment as deeply as Clara does. Clara stared at him, this impossible man who had crashed into her life and rearranged everything she thought she knew about power and wealth and what it meant to be cared for. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't enough, but it was all she had. Vincent lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture from another era, another world. "You never have to thank me," he said. "Not for this, not for anything." Chapter 4. Clara's mother came home from the hospital in February, weak but recovering, her eyes bright with a new appreciation for life. The home care nurse that Vincent had arranged turned out to be a cheerful woman named Patricia who could make Maria laugh even on her worst days, and slowly the Mitchell household began to heal. But as Clara's family crisis receded, new complications emerged. She had known intellectually that Vincent's world contained shadows. She had understood that the legitimate businesses, the charitable foundations, the respectable facade, all sat atop something older and darker. She had accepted this, or thought she had, burying the uncomfortable questions beneath her growing feelings for him. But February brought those shadows into focus. It started with a phone call that Vincent took in his office, speaking in rapid Italian that Clara couldn't follow. When he emerged, his face was drawn in a way she had never seen before. "There's a situation," he said. "Something I need to handle personally." "What kind of situation?" He hesitated, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to protect her from his reality, battling with something else, something that looked almost like longing for someone to share his burden with. "There's a man," he said finally, "someone who works for me. He's been taking money from the wrong people, making promises he can't keep, and now those people are making demands that put a lot of innocent workers at risk." "What kind of demands?" Vincent sat down heavily in his chair. "They want to use our shipping routes for their products. Substances that I've never allowed anywhere near my operations. Things that destroy communities, that poison children, that create the kind of suffering I spent my whole life trying to escape. So tell them no." "I have." His voice was tired. "And now they're threatening to expose certain aspects of my business that I've worked very hard to keep private. Things that could send a lot of good people to prison. Things that could destroy everything I've built." Clara absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. The good people he mentioned, she knew, were the same people she saw every day. The security guards with families, the staff members who had worked for the Moretti family for generations, Angela with her grandchildren, Rosa with her fierce pride and her secret generosity. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to meet with them," Vincent said. "Tomorrow night. There's a neutral location we've agreed on. I'm going to try to negotiate a solution that doesn't end in disaster. And if you can't, then I'll do whatever I have to do to protect the people who depend on me." He met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Including you." "Let me come with you," Clara said, the words surprising them both. "Absolutely not." His response was immediate, emphatic. "This isn't your world, Clara. These aren't people you want to know exist, but they do exist. And they're threatening the world I've come to care about." She stood her ground, refusing to look away. "I'm not asking to be in the meeting. I'm not asking to put myself in danger, but I can't just sit here and wait, not knowing what's happening, not knowing if you're okay." Vincent studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, some calculation she couldn't follow. "There's a restaurant across the street from the meeting location," he said finally. "If you want to wait there, with Marco outside, I won't stop you. But you stay in that restaurant no matter what. Promise me, I promise." The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following evening, at a warehouse in Red Hook that Vincent's family had owned for decades. Clara arrived at the restaurant across the street at 8:30, her nerves wound tight as piano wire. Marco had tried to talk her out of coming. Angela had called twice to express concern. Even Rosa had pressed a rosary into her hands with instructions to pray. But Clara was done being protected. She was done being kept at a distance from the reality of Vincent's life. If she was going to love him, and she could no longer deny to herself that she did, She needed to love all of him, even the parts that scared her. The restaurant was a small Italian place, the kind that had been there for generations, with red check tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. Clara ordered coffee she didn't want and watched the warehouse across the street through the window. At 9 o'clock exactly, a black car pulled up to the warehouse entrance. Vincent emerged, flanked by 2 men she recognized from his security team. They disappeared through a side door, and Clara began her vigil. The first hour passed slowly. Clara drank her cold coffee, ordered another she wouldn't drink, and tried not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. The second hour was worse. Her phone sat silent on the table, Vincent having promised to text if he needed more time. The silence felt ominous. It was nearly 11:30 when movement across the street caught her attention. The warehouse door opened, and people began emerging. Vincent first, his posture rigid but his stride confident. Behind him, a man Clara didn't recognize, older, grey-haired, wearing an expression of barely contained fury. And then everything happened at once. The grey-haired man shouted something Clara couldn't hear through the restaurant window. One of Vincent's guards turned, hand moving toward his jacket. The grey-haired man's companion, a younger man Clara hadn't noticed, raised his arm. Clara didn't think. She just moved. She was out the restaurant door before Marco could stop her, running across the street with her heart pounding so loud she couldn't hear her own footsteps. She saw Vincent turn toward her, saw his eyes go wide with something between fear and fury, saw his mouth form her name. And then she was between them, between Vincent and the threat. Her arms spread wide as if she could somehow shield him with her body. The younger man hesitated, his raised arm faltering. Clara locked eyes with him and saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty. Youth. The same desperate look she had seen in her own mirror for years. "Don't," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Whatever he's done, whatever you think he's done, this isn't the answer. Violence is never the answer." The moment stretched like taffy, time itself holding its breath. Then the grey-haired man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He said something in Italian to his companion, who lowered his arm. The tension in the air shifted, not quite dissolving, but changing into something less immediate. "Your woman has courage," the grey-haired man said to Vincent, his English accented but clear. "More than you deserve." "I know," Vincent said quietly. He stepped forward, gently moving Clara behind him. "But this conversation is over. We have an agreement. Honor it, and I'll honor mine." The grey-haired man studied him for a long moment. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and walked to his waiting car. His companion followed, casting one last uncertain glance at Clara before disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent turned to face her, and she braced herself for anger, for recriminations, for the explosion she deserved after breaking her promise. Instead, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice rough. "Do you understand me?" "Never again, I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I couldn't just watch. I couldn't. You could have been hurt. You could have been killed." He pulled back, gripping her shoulders, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "Don't you understand? Losing you would destroy me. Nothing in my world, nothing I've built, nothing I am would matter if something happened to you." Clara reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "I understand," she said, "because I feel the same way about you." They stood there in the cold February night, the warehouse looming behind them, and the city stretching out around them, 2 people who had found each other against all odds. "We should go," Marco said gently, breaking the spell. "This area isn't secure." Vincent nodded, but he didn't release Clara's hand. Together they walked to the waiting car, and together they drove back to a world that would never be quite the same. Chapter 5. The aftermath of that night changed everything. Vincent became more protective, more present, more openly devoted in ways that made Clara's heart ache. He rearranged his schedule to spend more time with her. He invited her mother and brother to dinner at the penthouse, where Rosa outdid herself and Maria Mitchell fell completely in love with the dangerous man who had saved her daughter's life. But with the change in their relationship came new dangers. Word had spread through the underground that Vincent Moretti had a weakness, that the cold, calculating boss who had ruled his empire with iron control had found something he cared about more than power. The first threat came in March, a note left at the penthouse entrance, addressed to Clara, in careful handwriting. "I know what you mean to him," it read. "I wonder what he would pay to keep you safe." Vincent hired additional security. Clara moved into the penthouse's guest suite, a temporary arrangement that both of them knew was becoming permanent. But the threats continued. escalating from notes to photographs, pictures of Clara leaving her mother's house, entering the Moretti building, walking through Central Park with Jake. Someone was watching her. Someone wanted Vincent to know it. "We need to find out who's behind this," Clara said one evening, studying the latest photograph with forced calm. "Before they decide that watching isn't enough." Vincent's jaw was tight. "I have people working on it." "Have. Let me help." He looked at her, a familiar argument flickering in his eyes. She was always wanting to help, always refusing to stay safely on the sidelines. It was one of the things he loved about her. It was also the thing that terrified him most. "There's something," he said finally, "but you're not going to like it." "Tell me." "The threats started after the warehouse meeting, after word got out that I had someone in my life worth threatening." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have contacts who can find out who's been talking, but to reach them, I need to move through certain two channels. Criminal channels." Criminal. Yes, Clara absorbed this. The line she had drawn in her mind, the separation between Vincent's legitimate world and his darker one, had been blurring for months. Now she realized it was time to acknowledge that the line had never really existed. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to trust me," he said. "Even when I can't tell you everything, even when what I'm doing might not be legal." She looked at him, this man who had become her whole world. "I already trust you." The investigation took weeks. Clara watched Vincent come and go at odd hours, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else she couldn't name. She learned not to ask questions when he returned with bruised knuckles or a torn jacket. She learned to trust, as she had promised, even when trust felt like falling. It was April when he finally came to her with answers. "It was Richard," he said, his voice flat. "Richard Castellano." Clara felt her stomach drop. "Richard? But he was exiled. You sent him away. I underestimated his bitterness." Vincent's expression was hard. "He's been planning this for months, feeding information to my competitors, trying to destabilize my organization, and when that didn't work, he decided to target you directly." The memory of that night at the restaurant flooded back, the cruel hand on her hip, the fury in Richard's eyes. "He blamed me," she said slowly, "for what happened to him. He blamed both of us, but mostly me. He wanted me to feel helpless the way he felt helpless. He wanted me to know what it was like to watch someone I cared about be threatened. What are you going to do?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to end it," he said finally, "whatever that takes." She understood what he meant. The finality in his voice left no room for interpretation. Richard Castellano had crossed a line from which there was no return. But instead of the fear she expected to feel, Clara found something else rising in her chest, a cold, hard certainty that some threats could only be met with absolute response. "I want to be there," she said. Vincent's head snapped toward her. "No, not for whatever you're planning, but I want to see him. I want him to know that I'm not afraid of him, that his attempts to terrorize me failed. Clara, you always say you want me to be part of your world, all of it, not just the pretty parts." She held his gaze. "This is part of it. This is me choosing to stand beside you, not behind you." The argument that followed was the worst they had ever had. Vincent shouted. Clara shouted back. Things were said that would have ended a lesser relationship, brutal honesty about fear and control and the limits of protection. But when the storm passed, when they stood breathing hard on opposite sides of his office, something new had emerged from the wreckage. "Tomorrow night," Vincent said, his voice hoarse, "I'll take you with me. But you stay back, you let me handle what needs to be handled, and when it's over, we leave together." "Agreed?" "Agreed." The confrontation took place in a building that Richard had been using as a hideout, a rundown tenement in a part of Queens that the city had forgotten. Vincent's people had been watching it for days, confirming Richard's movements, ensuring that he would be there when they arrived. Clara rode in the car with Vincent, their hands clasped between them, neither speaking. The city rolled past the windows, familiar streets transformed by darkness into something strange and threatening. When they arrived, Vincent turned to her. "Last chance," he said. "You can wait in the car. I'm coming with you." The building's interior was as decrepit as its exterior, water-stained walls and broken lights, and the smell of neglect. Vincent's security team went first, clearing each floor with professional efficiency. Clara followed behind Vincent, her heart pounding but her steps steady. They found Richard in a room on the 4th floor, surrounded by evidence of his schemes, papers covered in notes about the Moretti organization, photographs of Clara, a gun that he reached for too slowly, before one of Vincent's men knocked it from his grasp. "Well?" Richard said, forced casualness in his voice despite the fear in his eyes. The happy couple here to watch the show. How romantic. Vincent stepped forward, and Clara saw the predator that lurked beneath his civilized surface. "This is your one chance," he said quietly. "Tell me everything, every contact, every plan, every person who helped you. And maybe I'll let you walk away." Richard laughed, a desperate sound. "Walk away to what? You've already destroyed my life. What else can you possibly take from me?" Clara stepped forward then, drawing Richard's attention. His eyes widened, surprise breaking through his fear. "You think I destroyed your life?" she asked, her voice steady. "You destroyed your own life the moment you decided that hurting other people was an acceptable way to deal with your problems. You had every advantage, wealth, position, connections, and you threw it all away because you couldn't stand the idea of facing consequences for your actions." She moved closer and she saw Richard flinch, actually flinch from the intensity of her gaze. "I was nobody when we first met," she continued, "a waitress trying to survive. You looked at me and saw something disposable, someone you could touch, could hurt, without repercussions. But you were wrong. And this moment, right now, is the proof." The silence stretched out, filling the room with weight. Then Richard broke. The confessions spilled out of him in a torrent, names and dates and methods. Vincent's people recorded everything, gathered the evidence, assembled the case that would ensure Richard Castellano never threatened anyone again. When it was over, when Richard had been taken away and the building was empty except for the two of them, Vincent turned to Clara. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified. Being brave isn't the absence of fear." He took her hands in his. "Being brave is feeling the fear and standing your ground anyway. You're the bravest person I know." Clara looked around the dingy room, the scattered papers, the evidence of obsession and resentment. "This isn't the life I imagined for myself," she said. "Is that bad?" She turned back to him, this man who had become her everything. "No," she said, "it's different, it's complicated. It's sometimes scary and often confusing, but it's also real, it's ours." Vincent pulled her into his arms, holding her close in the dim light of that forgotten building. "Ours," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." Chapter 6. The spring gave way to summer, and with it came a new chapter in Clara's life. Richard Castellano's information led to the dismantling of the network that had been threatening the Moretti organization. Several competitors found themselves facing legal troubles that would occupy them for years. The gray-haired man from the warehouse meeting reached out with an offer of peace, recognizing that challenging Vincent Moretti came with costs he wasn't willing to pay. And through it all, Clara remained at Vincent's side. She had expected the transition from assistant to partner to be complicated, fraught with awkwardness and uncertainty. Instead, it felt natural, inevitable, like they had been moving toward this moment since the night he stood up for her in that restaurant. She still managed his calendar. She still coordinated with Angela and Rosa and the rest of the staff. But now she did it from a position of equality, her voice heard in meetings, her opinions valued in decisions that shaped the future of the Moretti organization. Her mother recovered fully, eventually moving into a comfortable apartment in Manhattan that Clara visited every Sunday. Jake graduated from community college with honors and won a scholarship to Columbia, where he planned to study engineering. The Mitchell family, which had struggled for so long, finally found solid ground beneath their feet. It was September, the first anniversary of the night they had met, when Vincent took Clara to La Fontaine. The restaurant looked exactly as she remembered: crystal chandeliers and marble floors, and wealthy patrons who didn't see the people serving them. But this time Clara entered through the front door, dressed in silk, her hand resting on Vincent's arm. Harold, the general manager, nearly dropped his tablet when he recognized her. "Miss Mitchell," he stammered. "Mr. Moretti, I didn't realize we would be welcome." "Of course you're welcome. Please, right this way." They were seated at the best table in the house, the one by the window with a view of Central Park. Clara ordered the tuna appetizer that had started everything, and when it arrived, perfectly plated and professionally served, she laughed. "What's funny?" Vincent asked. "I'm just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago I was serving these plates. Now I'm eating from them. Does that bother you?" She considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally, "because I earned this, not by marrying rich or winning the lottery, but by working hard and making choices and taking chances when they were offered. I earned every bite." Vincent reached across the table and took her hand. "You earned much more than that." They ate slowly, savoring the food and the company and the strangeness of being back where it all began. When the dessert plates were cleared, Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. Clara's heart stopped. "Before you say anything," Vincent said, "I want you to know that you can take as long as you need to answer. This isn't pressure. This isn't expectation. This is simply me telling you what I want and asking if you want the same thing." He opened the box, revealing a ring that was elegant rather than ostentatious, a single diamond set in white gold. "Clara Mitchell," he said, "a year ago you crashed into my life and changed everything I thought I knew about myself. You showed me that power means nothing without someone to share it with. You taught me that strength isn't about control, it's about trust. You made me believe that I could be more than what my past demanded." His eyes held hers, storm grey and steady. "I'm not asking you to give up who you are. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life supporting who you're becoming. I'm asking you to be my partner, my conscience, my home. I'm asking you to marry me." The restaurant had gone quiet around them, other diners pretending not to watch while obviously hanging on every word. Clara looked at the man across from her, this complicated, powerful, surprisingly tender man who had seen her when she was invisible and lifted her up when she was falling. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without doubt. Vincent slid the ring onto her finger, and when he leaned across the table to kiss her, the restaurant erupted into applause. They married in December, 1 year after the charity gala, where they had first acknowledged their feelings. The ceremony was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in the same space Clara had helped transform the year before. 500 guests witnessed the union, including Vincent's Aunt Catherine, who cried through the entire ceremony, and Clara's mother, who sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Jake served as Clara's escort down the aisle. Rosa catered the reception with food that made grown men weep with joy. Angela, newly retired and thoroughly pleased about it, danced with her grandchildren until midnight. And when the party was over, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Vincent and Clara stood alone on the museum steps, looking out at the city that had brought them together. "We should go home." Clara said, "We should," but Vincent made no move to leave. "I want to remember this moment, standing here with you, knowing that every moment from now on is ours." Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "It's a good moment. It's the best moment. Until the next one." She laughed, and he laughed with her, and they stood there as the city hummed around them, two people who had found in each other something they hadn't even known they were looking for. In the months that followed, Clara discovered what it meant to build a life with Vincent Moretti. There were challenges, of course. His world was still complicated, still shadowed by history and obligation, but together they navigated those shadows, pushing the organization toward legitimacy, establishing foundations and programs that gave back to communities like the one Clara had grown up in. She never forgot where she came from: the studio apartment in Queens, the worn black flats and the invisible service, the mother who had worked herself to exhaustion, and the brother who had worried he would never escape. She carried those memories with her like a compass, guiding her decisions, keeping her grounded even as her circumstances changed beyond recognition. Vincent never forgot either: the diner in Brooklyn, his mother's tired smile, the promise he had made to himself that when he had power, he would use it to protect people like her. Clara helped him keep that promise, her moral clarity cutting through the rationalizations and compromises that power often demanded. They were not perfect. They argued about priorities and strategies, and how to balance justice with mercy. But even their arguments were productive, two strong people pushing each other to be better, refusing to settle for less than they knew they could be. It was spring again when Clara realized something had changed in her body. The nausea, the exhaustion, the strange cravings and stranger dreams. She took the test alone in their bathroom, watched the lines appear with trembling hands, and sat on the cold tile floor crying tears she couldn't explain. When Vincent found her there, his face went white with fear. "What's wrong? What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, and simply held up the test. The transformation in his expression was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Fear to confusion, to understanding, to joy, each emotion flickering across his features like clouds across the sun. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice hushed. "We're having a baby." He gathered her up off the floor and held her close, laughing and crying at the same time. This powerful man undone by the smallest of miracles. "I'm going to be a father," he said. "You're going to be an amazing father. How do you know?" "Because I know you. Because I've seen the way you love, the way you protect, the way you pour yourself into everything that matters to you." She pulled back to look at him. This baby is going to be the luckiest child in the world. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, surrounded by the care and attention that Vincent insisted on. Clara continued to work, refusing to be treated like an invalid, but she allowed herself to slow down, to savor the changes happening in her body, to dream about the future. She thought often about her own childhood, the absences and the struggles, the ways that poverty had shaped her view of what was possible. Her child would have a different story, not a story of wealth for its own sake, but a story of security, of possibility, of parents who were present and devoted and completely, utterly in love. The baby was born on a Tuesday in November, a girl with her father's storm-grey eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Maria, after both of their mothers, and from the moment Vincent held her in his arms, he was completely and forever changed. "This is what it's all for," he said softly, looking down at his daughter's sleeping face. Every struggle, every sacrifice, it was all leading to this. Clara watched him with their child. This man who had been a stranger 2 years ago, who had become her partner, her lover, her husband, and now the father of her daughter. She thought about the night they had met, the cruelty and the kindness, the moment he had stood up and changed her life forever. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" she asked. "If you hadn't been at the restaurant that night, if Richard hadn't been there, if everything had been different?" Vincent looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "Every day," he admitted, "and every day I'm grateful that it happened exactly the way it did, because it brought me you, it brought me her. It brought me home." Clara reached out and took his hand, their daughter cradled between them. "Home," she repeated. She had spent so many years not knowing what that word meant, running, surviving, getting through one day to reach the next. But now, in this moment, surrounded by the people she loved, she finally understood. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't 4 walls and a roof and a door that locked. Home was the feeling of being known, being seen, being valued not for what you could do or what you could give, but simply for who you were. Home was standing in a restaurant, invisible and unimportant, and having a stranger recognize your worth. Home was choosing to love someone despite the complications, the dangers, the 1,000 reasons why it shouldn't work. Home was building a life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith after another. Clara Mitchell Moretti had found her home, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure that everyone who entered it felt as seen, as valued, as loved as she did. The chandelier light caught the diamond on her finger, scattering rainbow fragments across the ceiling. Outside the window, the city hummed with its endless energy. Millions of lives intersecting and separating, each one a story waiting to be told. Her story, the waitress who had been humiliated and the powerful man who had stood up for her, was just one of many. But it was hers, and it was beautiful. And that, Clara thought as she leaned into her husband's arms, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, was all that really mattered. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that defies expectations and courage that changes everything, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and join our community. Every like, every share, every comment helps us bring more stories like this to people who need them. Thank you for being here, thank you for believing, and thank you for watching until the very end. Until next time.